And now for our speaker. Dr. Tony Wagner is a change agent. His ideas on innovation are revolutionary and thought-provoking. He speaks to students of all ages, as well as parents, grandparents, educators, principals, and administrators, about the ways innovation can change our world and society. He currently serves as an expert in residence at Harvard University's Innovation Lab. So hold on to your seats. I present to you our speaker for the year for the Donors Appreciation Dinner, Dr. Tony Wagner.
Thank you, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you on this joyous occasion. And I want to start with a bit of good news. I'm going to be very brief. And I have no slides to show you. But the bad news is, I'm afraid I don't know anything about dentistry, except that I've had very, very good care, and even very little about medicine. So I'm not going to speak on those topics tonight. But let me ask you a question. How many of you are parents or grandparents? Raise your hands. How many of you are concerned citizens? Raise your hands. There's a couple hands back, not up there. I'm a little concerned. Well, that's the reason I want to talk with you. Not because of your esteemed reputations in the field of dentistry and medicine, but because you are parents, grandparents, and concerned citizens. I want to talk about education, but not in the usual kind of platitudes, I hope. I want to start first with a recognition. You know, when I started my teaching career, and yes, I'm a recovering high school English teacher, I began at the twilight of the industrial era, 1971. And then for the next 50 years, we've talked about a knowledge economy, a knowledge era. But what few people understand today is we don't have a knowledge economy anymore. Knowledge has become a commodity. It's free. It's like air. It's like water. It's on every internet-connected device. The world simply no longer cares how much your kids know. What the world cares about is what they can do with what they know. And that is a brand new and very different problem. Because today we have an innovation era, an innovation economy that is creating new challenges and demands fundamentally different things of our kids, our policymakers, and our country. I'll give just a quick highlight, a sneak preview of coming attractions. You know, in the eras in which we grew up, a degree from any college, let alone Harvard, virtually guaranteed you a job, right? Didn't have to worry about it very much. Not true. Right now today, the combined un- and underemployment rate of recent four-year college graduates, guess that number, 53%. What do I mean by underemployed? Well, I'm talking about BA-ristas or BA tenders. Kids who've graduated with an average of $30,000 of debt, but are not, in all likelihood, going to be able to repay that debt. What's happened? What's wrong with this picture? Well, you know, I've been talking to folks at Google recently, and it's an interesting and illustrative story. It used to be that Google only hired kids from Ivy League schools, and you only got an interview at Google if you had the highest GPAs and the highest test scores in those Ivy League schools. Well, along comes Laszlo Bock, Senior VP of People Operations. Being a good Googler, he relentlessly analyzes the data and discovers that these indices are, quote, worthless, unquote. His words. He goes on to say that the skills you need to succeed in a competitive academic environment bear absolutely no relationship to the skills you need to succeed in an innovation economy. Right now today, how does Google hire? Through structured interviews. They don't even ask whether or not you have a degree. 15% of the new Google hires don't have a degree at all. That's because they've come to understand that a transcript guarantees nothing these days. All it means is you've served 4 years of seat time. Now, I thought, well, that's Google, you know, that's Silicon Valley. They're crazy on that coast anyway. We knew that. But then I was in Ho Chi Minh City a year ago at the invitation of Deloitte, the accounting and consulting firm, talking to the CEO over lunch before my presentation to business leaders in the region. She quite spontaneously said, you know, we used to hire our best kids from our best universities. But she said, we discovered they don't work out so well. So what do they do now, she told me? They look for good students and they put them through a summer-long boot camp to try to understand how they solve problems collaboratively. Today's world cares less about your credentials than your competencies. So I have been preoccupied with this question with my most recent research. What must we do differently to prepare all of our young people to be innovators, to be ready for this economy? Not just high-tech innovators, but innovators who are in fact creative problem solvers, no matter what they are or where they are. Because that's one definition of innovation. It's not necessarily high-tech. It's someone who is a creative problem solver. You know, we're born curious, creative, imaginative. That's the human DNA. The average 4-year-old, as many of you may recall, asks 100 questions a day. And most kindergartners think of themselves as artists. But by the time those children are 12 today, most realize it's far more important to get the right answers than to keep asking questions. And almost none of them think of themselves as artists anymore. It's been schooled out of them, these qualities. So what do we need to do differently as educators, as parents? To answer that question, I interviewed a wide variety of young people in their 20s, all of whom were creative problem solvers, some in high tech, some social entrepreneurs solving social problems, some in the arts. I wanted to try to understand what were the influences that had shaped their upbringing and their development as creative problem solvers. Of course, I wanted to understand about their parenting, so I interviewed all of their parents and looked for patterns of parenting. Asked them about their education, and that led to my first troubling discovery. Some of these kids had gone to our leading universities, specifically Harvard, Stanford, MIT, Carnegie Mellon. To a person, they told me they had become innovators in spite of their schooling, not because of it. And my recent conversations with Harvard students throughout the university in my current position has only reinforced that finding. But I pushed, I probed. I said, come on. Now, there must have been a teacher who's made a significant difference in your development. Most could name one, rarely more than one or two. So I interviewed all those teachers, watched some of them teach. And I made then my second troubling discovery. In every single case, the teachers who had made the greatest difference in the lives of these young innovators were outliers in their institutions. Those of whom who taught at college, and I'm talking Harvard, Stanford, MIT, none of them had tenure, nor were they going to get tenure. But what I discovered was that their teaching was remarkably similar to one another, even though they'd never met, and even though the grade range was first grade to graduate school. Very troubling. So then I spent time hanging out in those few schools that really do have a track record of teaching the skills of innovation. And frankly, it didn't take me long because there aren't very many. But I went to the brand new MIT Media Lab. I went to the Institute of Design at Stanford, D School. I went to the brand new Olin College of Engineering, just down the road here. I went to High Tech High, New Tech High, Expeditionary Learning Schools, Reggio Emilia classrooms, Montessori schools, the Bing Nursery School on the campus of Stanford. And again, I saw a remarkably consistent pattern and approach to learning and teaching. And analyzing all of that, I've come to understand there's a fundamental set of contradictions between the culture of schooling, as we've all grown up with it, as it is continued to be practiced and perpetuated, between that culture, which is 125 years old, it goes back to the Committee of 10 in 1893, versus the culture that develops the capacity to innovate, to solve problems creatively. 5 contradictions. Contradiction number 1, conventional schools, we celebrate and reward individual achievement, right? Well, that's okay, except the problem is innovation is above all a team sport. There is no innovation without deep teamwork. That's the opening lines to Walter Isaacson's new book about innovation. Knowing this, these teachers built accountable teamwork into every single project they gave their students, and they evaluated their students both according to their individual contributions and to their contributions to the team. They also team-taught whenever they possibly could, because they understood that the central problem with teaching today is its isolation. Isolation is the enemy of improvement. Isolation is the enemy of innovation. And sadly, education is one of the most isolated professions in modern work life. Contradiction number 2 is all about how we compartmentalize knowledge and favor specialization. going back to a system that was called the Carnegie Unit and developed by this Committee of 10 in 1893 and remains unchanged to this present day. Problem is, I learned, innovation happens at the boundaries of academic disciplines, almost never within them. Knowing this, these teachers built interdisciplinary courses around problems that needed to be understood or big questions that needed to be explored and couldn't be answered with just one discipline. Contradiction number 3 is the culture of the classroom. So culture in so many conventional high schools and colleges is a culture of passivity, a culture of consumption, and even a culture of infantilization. Because there's only one expert in the room, and that's the one at the front doing all the talking. By contrast, the culture of the classroom, where you're learning to innovate, is a culture of creating, not consuming. You're working on real problems, trying to find real solutions, or looking at big questions. It's a culture of empowerment, where the teacher sees his or her role as being that to empower students and to be a performance coach, coaching students to a higher performance standard. Contradictions 4 and 5, I think, are the most challenging and problematic of all. Contradiction 4 is all about the F word in schools. No, not that one. Failure. Worst thing that can happen to you in school, right? Number one nightmare of American adults, not being ready for the test or something of the sort. The fear of failure not only creates a culture of compliance, but it's more than that. It creates a culture of risk aversion for both the kids and the adults. You know, I was at Amherst College speaking a couple of weeks ago to students, and they were talking with me about all the pressures to be a perfect kid in order to get into Amherst. They could never, ever make a mistake. There's no such thing as a gentleman's or gentlewoman's B or C. Not anymore. But here's the problem. Innovation demands that you take risks, that you make mistakes, and that you fail. I went to IDEO, the most innovative design company in the world. They told me their company motto is fail early, fail often. Other companies talk about failing fast, failing forward, failing cheap, but failing. They don't really mean failure. What they mean is that there is no innovation without trial and error. I was talking to folks at the D School at Stanford. One guy seriously said, you know, I'm kind of thinking F is the new A. Now, I'm not recommending that for your kids' schools. Just it needs a little work. Though nobody's going to understand that just yet. But the point was, it was really made most clear to me when I talked to a young woman at Olin, the Olin College of Engineering. She said, you know, we don't talk about grades. We don't worry about GPAs. But she said, we obsess over iteration. My new favorite word, iteration. What does that mean? It means looking at your work, what you did in a project or a course, reflecting on it, understanding what went well and what didn't, and then, importantly, applying what you've learned to your next effort, to version 2.0 or 3.0. Knowing this, these teachers in these schools that teach innovation assess students according to a body of work, not individual pieces, and look for evidence of progress over time in that body of work. Fundamentally, there are only 3 grades that I can defend. A, B, or incomplete. A B is my performance standard when I teach. I expect every student to meet that, though some students may need additional help or time. I mean, come on, how many of you want to fly with a C- airline pilot? Raise your hands. We don't. It's a ridiculous grade. You're either competent or you're not. You know, and so that's how the adult world works. A few of us, a few people, rarely are exceptional, the A's. There's one thing I think that we should take away as we think about this, is allowing our kids to learn through trial and error. What if we said to every kid, sorry, you can't talk until you can speak in perfect grammatically correct sentences. And, oh, and by the way, no walking until you can walk a straight line. And let's forget this bicycle business, because we know you're going to fall down and skin your knee. In fact, I believe the most important learning comes from trial and error. How many of you learn more from your mistakes than your successes? Raise your hands. Sadly, that's not the way school works. Now we come to the last contradiction. And it has to do with motivation, and it may be the most important of all. You know, we rely heavily on extrinsic incentives to motivate learning. You know, rewards for good grades, fear of failure. But what I discovered was that every one of these young innovators, both from privilege and from poverty, And in subsequent interviews with young people all over the world, what I've discovered is that these young people are far more intrinsically motivated. They do their best work in school because it's work worth doing, not just to get an A. They do their best work in a company because they want to make a difference, not that they want to make a lot of money. So I went back. I tried to understand, where did that come from? That encouragement and nurturance of intrinsic motivation. I went back through all of my interviews with both parents and teachers. And that led to my final discovery. In every single case, both parents and teachers had explicitly encouraged three things: play, passion, and purpose. Parents encouraged much more exploratory play, fewer toys, toys without batteries. They limited screen time. Teachers trying to bring a spirit of play into the classroom. It was Ed Carrier, who teaches engineering to Stanford students, talked with me about bringing an element of whimsy into the kinds of projects he made up for his students. As these kids grew older, the parents were very intentional about carefully observing their play, trying to understand what most engaged their children. And to the extent of their resources, they offered opportunities for kids to explore new interests, new possibilities. Because they believed, when I talked with them, they believed that it was more important for a young person to find and discover a real interest that might grow into a passion than it was merely to achieve academically for its own sake. They believed, as do I, that the ways in which we learn grit, perseverance, tenacity, self-regulation has much more to do with pursuing an interest that becomes a passion than it does with having a tiger mom sitting on our shoulders. But as these kids grew older, their passions morphed and evolved. They didn't stay the same. But in every case, they matured to a deeper sense of purpose, a desire to in some way give back or make a difference. And that's because both parents and teachers had instilled this simple idea that we are not here on this earth just to serve ourselves. We have some responsibility to give back and to make a difference, even if only in small ways. So let me take 1 or 2 minutes to explore, I think, some of the implications and opportunities for action from you. And then I'll, if there's time, take a couple of questions. The first implication of all of this work is that competencies matter most. All kids today will need three things. Of course, they'll continue to need content knowledge, but that's the easy part. You don't necessarily need a teacher or a school to acquire content knowledge. Secondly, they will need skill. Talk about the skills of critical thinking, collaboration, communication, creative problem solving. And finally, they will need will, meaning intrinsic motivation and a moral sensibility. Of the three, I argue, will or motivation is the most important and the one that we consistently do the most damage to in our conventional forms of schooling and in our test-based accountability system. So I urge you to become better informed about the outcomes that matter most in an innovation era. I urge you to become advocates for the most important outcomes for your kids and grandkids and communities, schools. We need powerful advocates who can stand up at school boards and in state legislators and so on and say, look, what we're testing today is worthless. These tests tell us almost nothing about work, citizenship, or learning readiness in the 21st century. We have to assess competencies, and there are ways to do that, which we can get into in the Q&A if you want. Secondly, I encourage you to think about the importance of doing educational research and development. You know, Cisco's R&D budget is 13%, Microsoft's 17%, Google well over 20%. What's your R&D budget at Stratum? Is he still here, the gentleman? No, he had to leave. I'd be curious to know. But even a manufacturing company like 3M has a 6% R&D budget. Go back and find out. What's the R&D budget of your elite independent school or your public school? Well, it's a joke because they don't have one. We cannot expect change unless we are willing to fund educational research and development. Now, finally, my colleagues and I have made a new movie called Most Likely to Succeed. It had its world premiere at Sundance in January. I'm not going to show you a clip. I brought it along, but I think the evening is late. However, you can go see the trailer and sign up for updates and learn how you can sponsor community showings of this important film. So go to likelytosucceed.org. Perhaps Nancy will be able to email this out to you. Likelytosucceed.org. She can email this film clip out to you as well, so you can see it. It's a little 5-minute clip showing what schools look like that teach these skills. Folks, I enormously appreciate the fact that you've been very patient. I can slightly hear your stomachs growling, and I completely understand. But if you have an interest, I'd be happy to take a couple of questions if we have time. Do we have time, Dean? Okay. A couple questions or comments? And my feelings won't be hurt if there's total silence because you're ready to go for dinner. I would get that. Yes, please. Nice and loud, please, so folks can hear you.
Yeah, I don't know if you probably are familiar with Paul Tau's book.
Paul Tufts' book, yes, How Children Succeed. It's excellent.
He focuses a lot on grit.
Yes, he does.
A little bit about that?
Well, I completely agree. For those of you who don't know, Paul Tufts written a bestseller called How Children Succeed. The research is that so-called grit matters more than IQ in terms of adult success. By grit, he means perseverance, tenacity, self-regulation, self-discipline. There's a lot in that book about the damage poverty does to developing brains. For those of you who have a medical inclination, it's incredibly important research. The damage done to the prefrontal cortex and the development of synapses from stress, and the number one stressor for children is poverty. And our poverty rate in this country is 22%, something we never want to talk about. So that's the first takeaway from me for Tufts' book. But above and beyond that, it goes right to the issue of motivation. It's what I've tried to suggest. If we really want to develop young people's grit, and I taught my first 5 years at-risk kids in an alternative public high school, where I learned if you wanted them to learn stuff, you had to engage them. You had to find out what interested them. You had to give them hope and a sense of possibilities for the future. They were not going to learn grit unless and until they had some reason to learn. And that became my most important job, was to discover, to uncover what most engaged and interested them and support it no matter what. The parents of poor kids whom I interviewed did the same, by the way. It's very, very striking. Other questions or comments? Yes, please. I'll see you.
Richard Lou's book, Last Child in the Woods.
Yes.
How much of what kids are doing now, being technically connected and not really being connected to their environment, is really a byproduct of what's going on in education?
Well, I worry a lot about kids losing connection with nature. You know, it's interesting that some people say that the roots of the innovative spirit in American culture actually comes from the farm. Because you couldn't call up somebody and say, hey, come fix my tractor, or why are my crops failing? You had to figure it out. You had to innovate. And today, I worry that too many kids are disconnected from the spirit of nature and the opportunities to just go figure stuff out. As one parent said to me, you know, sometimes kids have to get bored in order to learn how to get unbored. Yes, sir.
I spent quite a few years, 40-odd years as a clinician, and I found that the breakthroughs and changes and improvements that I made came from outline individual dentists, almost none from dental schools.
Yeah. I'll leave the dean to answer that question. But no, really, your experience reinforces what I learned in the research, that schools are often organized to sort of create certain kinds of conventions. And, you know, we succeed at school by being good at those conventions. And an outlier is by nature a little bit rebellious and often doesn't fit or isn't often appreciated in a conventional organizational context. And I think that's one of the greatest challenges for universities today. Yes, ma'am, you had a question.
So almost like a follow-up to that question, I'm curious about what do you think is going to take to change mindset? So as you noted, education is long-standing. So this difference of the culture of schooling versus the culture of innovation is going to require a type of change.
Yes, it
but
is.
I think we all know when we ask people to change, the very first thing you face is resistance because people don't want to lose something.
Yeah.
So if I'm worried about losing this pre-established institution that has worked for some, maybe not for all, what's the impetus for education to work?
That's a fabulous question. We got to recognize, first of all, I think that the status quo is locked in so much today by fear. Parents are terrified. They believe the only way to give their kids a competitive advantage is get them into an Ivy League school, when in fact that's no longer the case. Teachers are terrified. They've got to raise test scores for their kids or lose their jobs. So in that culture of fear, we need to introduce this whole idea of not merely getting incrementally better at schooling, but reimagining education. Sort of freeing up people to a sense of new possibilities. You know, we parents want schools to look like the ones we went to or the ones we wished we'd gone to. We teachers teach in the ways they've been taught. You can't change minds with a book. I know, I've written 5 or 6. What we hope is that this movie we've created, and this is why we've spent 3 hours and $2 million on it, gives people a picture of what better possibilities look like. They can see it, they can smell it, they can touch it and taste it. You'll see for yourselves when you see the film. We're hoping that the combination of a different vision of education that is grounded in real schools, plus a community-wide conversation, can begin to change the tide here. Because I think more and more people are aware that schooling is not working for large numbers of kids, not just the most disadvantaged kids, but all kinds of kids in all kinds of communities. Great question. I suspect that may be the end of our Q&A. I know I've sort of risked the boundaries of your patience, but I appreciate it enormously. I've greatly enjoyed this conversation. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
I have something for you.
No,
Don't leave it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. We have a gift on behalf to give to Dr. Wagner, and I'll give him his gift, but I wanted each of you to give him a gift by shaking his hand on our way out. And if you would then leave the auditorium, your seat number is on the back of your tag. And the band will greet you as you walk into the tent tonight. Thank you.